Lieutenant Sarah Hayes stood quietly at the edge of the mess hall, her boots clicking softly against the floor. As she hesitated just beyond the door, the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted chicken filled the air, but it did little to calm the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She had been summoned here on orders that didn't seem to make sense for someone of her rank and experience. She had earned every stripe on her uniform, every medal on her chest with blood and sweat. Yet now she was here to serve lunch to a group of men who sat high in their command chairs without a care in the world except for how to maintain their hold on power. The generals whose names were whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in the hallways of the base had no idea who she was or what she had done. Her silver star was just another decoration to them, something to be ignored in favor of more important things. At least that's how it felt as she stood in the doorway, feeling more like an outsider than an officer. Her heart raced with uncertainty, but she knew better than to show any weakness. Her mind was sharp and focused. She was a soldier. No matter the task at hand, the generals sat around the long table chatting in. Low murmurs as they picked at their meals, their conversations full of strategy and power plays. Their words were rich with confidence and privilege. They didn't know her or care to, and for a moment Sarah felt a pang of resentment, something she quickly pushed away. The silver star on her uniform didn't matter. In this room, she was just another face in the crowd, another pair of hands to carry out the mundane orders of the day. Her job was simple: serve lunch and leave no questions asked. Took a deep breath and walked forward with purpose, each step echoing in the silence as she moved toward the serving station. Her eyes scanning the room, she made sure to avoid eye contact with anyone as she kept her movements steady and practiced. But as she reached the serving line, one of the generals finally glanced up from his conversation, his eyes locking onto her chest, where the silver star rested gleaming under the overhead lights. For a split second, his expression flickered from indifference to something else, something deeper, something she couldn't quite place, before he quickly turned his gaze back to the conversation he had been having. But by then, it was too late. The silence in the room was palpable. It spread like a virus infecting everyone at the table. The chatter stopped almost immediately as the generals became aware of what had just happened. There was no longer the casual atmosphere of a meal among colleagues. Now the room had shifted into something more serious, something charged with the weight of unspoken questions. Sarah could feel the tension in the air thickening. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but she could tell something had changed. It wasn't just the generals noticing the silver star. It was the way they noticed it. They didn't see a piece of metal. They saw something more. They saw a story. They saw a challenge. The one general who had looked at her now shifted in his seat, a subtle change, but enough for Sarah to notice it. His posture straightened and his eyes narrowed as he studied her for a few moments, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered on her chest, and then he spoke softly but with authority, his voice cutting through the tension. "You." He began the single word hanging in the air with such intensity that the entire room fell silent in anticipation. "You've seen combat, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one that carried weight. It was one that had power behind it, like a knife sliding into the softest part of your armor. It wasn't just an observation, it was an accusation wrapped in curiosity. Sarah froze for a brief moment. Her heart skipped a beat, but her face remained unreadable. She had trained for moments like this, trained for everything that could come with the silver star she had earned. She had faced much worse than the scrutiny of generals. She had faced death itself, and had come out the other side. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, her mind clear and her posture unyielding. "Yes, sir," she replied evenly, her voice steady and firm. Despite the rising tension around her, the room held its collective breath, waiting for something more, a revelation, a reaction. But instead there was only silence. The generals exchanged glances as if something unsaid passed between them. The air seemed to thicken further as if the very weight of her words hung above them like a storm. Cloud ready to burst? Sarah stood still waiting for what came next. There was no returning to the casual atmosphere of, before the room had shifted into something new, something more dangerous. General Adams, the one who had first spoken, cleared his throat and pushed back his chair. Standing up slowly, he took a few steps toward Sarah, his expression unreadable as he approached her with deliberate movements. The others watched closely, their eyes flicking between the two of them as if the very air had become charged with a new kind of energy. He stopped in front of her, looking her over carefully, taking in every detail of her uniform, the silver star that marked her as a woman who had faced the worst of what the world could throw at her. But Sarah didn't flinch. She stood tall and proud. Despite the unease gnawing at her insides, she had seen enough battles to know when to stay calm, when to wait for the other shoe to drop. And she had a feeling it was about to drop hard. "You're not just any officer, are you?" General Adams said. His voice lowered this time, but his words felt like a blade slicing through the air. "You've been through something no one here can understand." His eyes never left her face, as if searching for something, a crack in her armor, a weakness, a sign that she might reveal what had brought her to this moment. But Sarah didn't offer anything. She kept her face neutral and her posture steady. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned away with a slight shake of his head and returned to his seat. The other generals remained silent, still processing what had just transpired, but there was an unspoken shift in the air. Now they were looking at her differently, not as just another officer, but as someone with a history, someone with a past that might hold more secrets than they could imagine. The room seemed to grow colder despite the warmth of the meal that had been served, and Sarah knew that nothing would ever be the same after this moment. The generals would be watching her now, watching her every move, every word, every gesture. They had seen the silver star, they had seen what she was capable of, and in their eyes she had become something more than just a server of lunch. She had become a puzzle, something to be figured out, and she was left standing there in the center of it all, waiting for the next move, knowing that the answers she held could change everything. And that was when the door to the mess hall opened with a sudden crash, startling everyone inside. Captain Markson stepped through the doorway, his figure imposing and his expression unreadable as he scanned the room, his eyes flicking over each of the generals before landing on Sarah for just a moment. But that moment was enough for her stomach to drop. The sudden rush of unease that flooded through her was enough to send a chill down her spine. Something was off. Something was wrong. Captain Markson had no reason to be here, and yet here he was standing in the doorway, looking like a man who had just stepped out of a nightmare. The generals hadn't noticed his arrival yet, but Sarah had, and in that moment she realized the game had changed. Something was coming. Something she hadn't expected, and it was standing right in front of her. The room fell dead silent as Captain Markson stood in the doorway, his eyes locking onto Sarah with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. She hadn't seen him in months, but the memory of him was vivid in her mind, sharp like a blade. She had tried to bury the thoughts of their last mission together, but now they came rushing back to the surface like a tidal wave, threatening to drown her. Sarah's breath hitched as Markson slowly stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. She could feel the tension building the eyes of the generals, all shifting from her to him, as if sensing that something had shifted. Something that none of them fully understood yet. But Sarah knew she was the key to it all. Her heart raced in her chest, but she did everything she could to keep her face neutral, to keep her emotions buried where they belonged. Captain Markson had always been a man of few words. A man who didn't reveal anything about himself, not even to his own team, but in this moment, everything about him screamed danger, and she knew it was no coincidence that he had appeared here in the mess hall. At this very moment, the air seemed to thicken around them like the calm before a storm. She could almost hear the weight of his footsteps echoing through the room as he closed the distance between them, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold as steel. Sarah's mind raced with a million thoughts of what this could mean. Why was he here? And why had he come now, when everything had just begun to spiral out of control? The generals looked between the two of them, confused, their eyes flicking from Sarah to Markson, trying to piece together the significance of his arrival. But Sarah couldn't afford to dwell on their curiosity. Not yet. She had to stay focused on the man standing before her, the man who had been both a mentor and a ghost from her past, the man who knew more about her than anyone else, alive, the man who had been there with her when everything had gone wrong, when they had been forced to make decisions that no one would ever understand, when they had fought side by side against impossible odds, only to be left scarred by the choices they had made. Captain Markson had been more than just a commanding officer to her. He had been a friend, a confidant, someone who had understood the weight of the burden they carried together. But that was before the betrayal, before the mission went south, before the lies and the cover-ups, before the truth was buried so deep that neither of them had been able to reach it again. And now here he was, standing in front of her, looking as if he knew something no one else did, as if he held the key to her darkest secret, something she had hoped to never share with anyone, the truth that had driven a wedge between them, a truth that had changed everything. Markson stopped just a few feet away from Sarah, his eyes narrowing as he looked her over, taking in the silver star that adorned her chest, and the way she stood so still, so composed in front of him. He knew her better than anyone else in this room. He had seen her in the heat of battle, seen her make decisions that no one else would have dared to make, seen her sacrifice everything for the mission. But now he was looking at her as if she were a stranger, as if she were someone he could no longer trust. The tension in the room thickened as the generals began to shift in their seats, sensing the growing storm, but none of them dared to speak. They were all waiting for Markson to make his move to reveal what he had come here for. Sarah could feel her pulse racing as she stood there, locked in a silent standoff with the man who knew her better than anyone else, but who also held the power to expose her in ways she could never imagine. He hadn't said a word yet, but she knew that the moment he did, everything would change, and there would be no turning back. Markson's voice was low when he finally spoke his words, cutting through the silence like a knife. "I don't know what game you're playing here, Sarah, but you're not fooling anyone." The words stung like a slap to the face, and Sarah's stomach twisted as she felt a familiar heat rise to her cheeks. But she didn't react. She couldn't react. Not in front of the generals. Not now. Not when everything was hanging by a thread. She had trained herself to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was personal. Markson continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're hiding something, and I don't know what it is, but I'm going to find out." The finality in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine, and for the first time since walking into the mess hall, she felt the floor beneath her feet begin to shift, like the very foundation of everything she knew was starting to crumble. The generals exchanged uneasy glances, their faces betraying their confusion and curiosity, but Sarah's mind was focused solely on Markson. She could feel the weight of his gaze burning into her skin. His words echoed in her mind like a warning she had tried to bury. The past tried to move on from the mistakes they had made. But now it was all coming back to the surface, and there was nowhere to hide. She could feel the tension building inside her chest, the pressure of the unspoken truth threatening to burst through. But she held it back. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when everything was at stake. "I'm not hiding anything," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. Her eyes locked onto Markson's, as if daring him to challenge her. "You don't know what you're talking about." Markson's eyes hardened at her response, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. "I know exactly what I'm talking about, Lieutenant." His words were like a threat hanging in the air between them, his expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, something that Sarah couldn't quite decipher, but that only made her more uneasy. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing. Tighter and tighter as the silence stretched on, Sarah could feel the weight of the general's eyes on her. Their curiosity palpable. They were waiting for an answer, waiting for her to reveal something that would explain why Markson had shown up unannounced and why he was so determined to expose her. But Sarah couldn't give them that answer. She couldn't give them anything. Not when she was teetering on the edge of losing everything she had fought so hard to protect. She could feel her breath quickening as the pressure built, the pounding in her chest growing louder and louder with each passing second. The room felt suffocating, and she had to fight to keep her composure. Had to fight to keep the lie intact. The lie that had kept her alive and protected her from the truth that she had never been able to face, the lie that had started with Markson and ended with the mission that had gone horribly wrong. And then it happened. The one thing she hadn't prepared for. Markson's eyes flicked to her chest one more time, and in that instant, something inside him seemed to snap a subtle shift in his demeanor, but it was enough to make Sarah's stomach drop. His gaze lingered on the silver star that gleamed on her uniform, and for the briefest moment she saw something in his eyes, something that sent a shiver down her spine, a flicker of recognition, but also something else, something darker, something that made Sarah's blood run cold before she could react. Markson's voice broke the silence once more. "I know how you got that star, Sarah." His words were quiet, but they hit like a bombshell in the stillness of the room. The generals leaned forward. Their interest peaked, but Sarah's mind went blank. Her pulse surged as her worst fears began to take shape. The one thing she had hoped would stay buried had just been brought into the light, and there was no escaping it now. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud casting shadows over the room. Captain Markson's revelation cut through the tense silence like a blade. Sarah felt a chill ripple down her spine as the weight of his statement settled heavily on her chest. She stood motionless, her eyes locked on Markson, searching for any hint of mercy or malice. But his expression remained unreadable, cold and distant, like the man who had become a stranger to her in recent months. The generals leaned in their seats, their curiosity now fully awakened, the atmosphere charged with a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and something bordering on accusation. Every eye in the mess hall was fixed on Sarah, waiting for her to respond to the explosive claim that threatened to shatter everything she had built. Sarah's mind raced frantically, trying to grasp the implications of Markson's words. She had fought long and hard to earn every medal, every commendation on her uniform, especially the silver star that now seemed like a beacon drawing unwanted attention. She could feel the room closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter, as if the past she had tried to escape was finally catching up. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but her voice steady when she finally spoke. "Captain Markson, you're mistaken," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "I earned this star with my own actions on the battlefield. I did what was necessary to save my unit." There was a defiance in her tone, a quiet strength born from years of training and experience, but she knew deep down that Markson's words were not so easily dismissed. He was someone who had been there with her, who had witnessed the mission firsthand, the mission that had changed everything between them, and now he was challenging her very honor and integrity. "General." Adams broke the silence, stepping forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Lieutenant Hayes," he began, "this is a serious accusation and one that cannot be taken lightly. We expect the truth and nothing less from our officers." The other generals nodded in agreement, their faces stern as if ready to judge her with the full force of military law. Sarah felt the weight of their expectations crushing down on her, but she refused to crumble. She knew the truth was complicated more than what Markson was willing to admit. But she also knew that revealing too much could destroy her career and, more importantly, her life. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to retreat into silence. "I am willing to provide a full report," she said, "but some details must remain classified for security reasons." The generals exchanged glances, some skeptical, others seemingly satisfied, but the tension in the room did not dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Sarah's secrets. Captain Markson shook his head slowly, his eyes darkening. "Lieutenant, you don't get to decide what is classified and what isn't when it comes to your conduct and the truth." His tone was harsh, as if he had lost all patience. "The brass deserves to know what really happened." There was a bitter edge to his voice that made Sarah flinch for a moment. The man who had once been her ally was now her fiercest critic, and it was clear he was not going to back down. The generals watched closely, their interest now fully focused on the unfolding drama between the two officers. The room felt like a courtroom. Sarah, the defendant, and Markson, the relentless prosecutor, locked in a battle that went far. Beyond the present moment, memories flooded Sarah's mind, the mission replaying like a broken record in her thoughts. The ambush, the chaos, the decision she had made to disobey orders in order to save her team, the faces of her fallen comrades, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears. She had taken responsibility for her actions, but the cost had been high. The betrayal, the cover-up, the lies that had followed had driven a wedge between her and Markson, had fractured the trust they once shared, and now it threatened to destroy her completely. Yet even as the past loomed over her, she refused to give in to despair. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met Markson's gaze. Head on, suddenly a sharp knock echoed through the mess hall, drawing everyone's attention. The door swung open, and a figure stepped inside, a senior intelligence officer, known for her unwavering dedication to the truth. Her presence added another layer of gravity to the situation. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Sarah. "Lieutenant Hayes," she said clearly, "I have reviewed your debriefing report, and I require a private word with you and Captain Markson." The generals nodded approvingly, signaling their willingness to hear more. But the moment was heavy with anticipation. Sarah knew this was no ordinary request. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that could either clear her name or bury her forever. She followed the intelligence officer out of the room. Her heart pounding in her chest, Markson trailed behind. Silently, the distance between them filled with unspoken tension as they walked through the sterile corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the hum of distant machinery created a soundtrack to her rising anxiety. The private meeting room was stark and cold, a far cry from the chaos of the battlefield. But here, the war was just as brutal, just as unforgiving. Sarah took a seat across from the intelligence officer and glanced at Markson, who leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk waiting for her to falter. The intelligence officer began her briefing, pulling out documents and images from a secure tablet. "We have uncovered new evidence relating to the mission in question," she said, her voice steady. "Information that could shed light on the discrepancies in your reports." Sarah's eyes widened as she leaned forward, eager yet fearful to hear what they had found. The images showed satellite data, intercepted communications, and eyewitness testimonies, some of which conflicted with Markson's version of events. Others seemed to support Sarah's claims. It was a tangled web of truth and deception that made it difficult to know where to place one's faith. The generals had wanted a simple answer, but what they were about to receive was anything but simple. Markson broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "This changes everything," he said. "If this evidence holds up, it could exonerate Lieutenant Hayes or implicate her even further." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing. She was caught between relief and dread, knowing that the outcome of this investigation would determine her fate. The silver star she wore with pride was no longer just a symbol of courage, but a beacon attracting scrutiny and suspicion alike. The past she had tried to bury was alive and breathing, threatening to consume her whole. As the meeting drew to a close, the intelligence officer looked directly at Sarah. "You will need to cooperate fully with our investigation," she said, "and be prepared for the consequences no matter what they may be." The words echoed in the cold room like a verdict. Sarah swallowed hard and nodded her agreement, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long, painful journey. She glanced once more at Markson, whose expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something else. Regret, maybe, or perhaps. A recognition that the battle between them was far from over. Returning to the mess hall, Sarah was met with a mix of reactions from the generals. Some offered silent nods of approval, while others whispered behind their hands. Their judgment was suspended, waiting for the investigation to unfold. But one thing was clear. Sarah Hayes was no longer the officer they had dismissed earlier that day. She was now at the center of a storm that could either wash away the doubts or drown her beneath its waves. The silver star on her uniform glinted in the light, reminding her that bravery sometimes meant standing alone in the face of overwhelming odds, and that the truth was often the hardest battle to win. The investigation began immediately. With an intensity that left no room for doubt or mercy, Sarah found herself pulled from one briefing to another, her every word scrutinized and dissected as if her very life depended on it. The weight of suspicion hung over her like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. Her fellow officers avoided her gaze, and whispers followed her down the corridors. The silver star, once a symbol of honor, now felt like a target painted on her chest. She battled exhaustion and doubt, but her resolve remained unbroken. She would face whatever came with the same courage that had carried her through every mission. Captain Markson's presence was a constant shadow looming over the investigation. The man who had once been her closest ally had transformed into her fiercest adversary. He pressed hard for answers, challenging her every statement, his cold scrutiny relentless, yet beneath the harsh exterior. Sarah caught glimpses of a man torn by conflicting loyalties. A man who perhaps struggled with the ghosts of their shared past, but there was no room for sentimentality here, only the harsh light of truth or deception. The generals watched closely as the two danced their delicate dance of accusation and defense. The outcome, uncertain and precarious, days turned into weeks, and the investigation unraveled layers of secrecy and lies. Sarah's world shifted as classified files were revealed and testimonies from witnesses surfaced. Some confirmed her version of events, while others contradicted it, creating a maze of conflicting narratives and half-truths. The media caught wind of the controversy, feeding the public's hunger for scandal and heroism. The military base became a pressure cooker of speculation and tension, with every new revelation threatening. To tip the balance, Sarah found herself thrust into the harsh glare of the spotlight, forced to confront the past she had tried so desperately to escape. Amidst the chaos, one thing remained clear. Sarah's courage and leadership had saved lives on that fateful mission. Despite the controversies, her actions had made the difference between survival and disaster for her unit. Yet the question lingered. Would that be enough to clear her name, or would the shadows of doubt forever taint her legacy? The silver star had become a symbol of both honor and suspicion, a paradox that Sarah had to navigate with care and conviction. The generals debated fiercely, weighing the evidence and the potential consequences for the army and for Sarah herself. In a tense closed-door session, the generals gathered to deliver their verdict. The room was heavy with anticipation as Sarah waited outside the door, her heart pounding like a drumbeat. She replayed every moment, every decision, every sacrifice, wondering if it would be enough to sway the judgment she had faced death on the battlefield. But this was a different kind of fight, one that tested her soul and her very identity. When the door finally opened, General Adams stepped out, his face unreadable, but his eyes carrying a weight of finality. He gestured for Sarah to enter, and she walked in with steady steps, her fate hanging in the balance. The generals spoke one by one, their voices measured and deliberate. They acknowledged the bravery and decisive action Sarah had taken under impossible circumstances, but they also noted the discrepancies and failures in protocol that could not be overlooked. The debate was nuanced and complex, reflecting the realities of war and the burdens of command. After a long and grueling deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Sarah was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but the investigation would remain on her record, a permanent reminder of the controversy that had engulfed her career. The Silver Star would remain hers, but its meaning would forever be complicated. Relief washed over Sarah like a tidal wave, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from over. The whispers would continue. The doubts would linger. But she had emerged. From the storm, standing tall and unbroken, the generals offered their respect, acknowledging her strength and resilience. But the road ahead would demand even more from her than the fight she had left behind. The truth had been fought for and won, but the cost was etched into her very being, a scar deeper than any wound on the battlefield. As Sarah left the base that evening, the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows, she looked down at the silver star glinting in the fading light. Symbol of courage, sacrifice, and now survival. She knew the journey ahead would be filled with new challenges, new battles, but she was ready. She had faced the darkest parts of herself and had come through stronger and more determined than ever before. The story of the female officer who had been told to serve lunch and then stood against the highest generals was far from over. It was a story of resilience, courage, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. And as the night settled in, Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the greatest battles were not always fought with weapons, but with truth and the will to stand firm when everything else seemed to crumble. She was ready for whatever came next, for she had earned more than just a medal. She had earned her place in a world that had tried to silence her, and she would not be silenced again.